Arthur Schopenhauer published his life's work at age 30. Within that single volume, he explained the fundamental nature of reality, the source of all human suffering, and the only rational response to existence. The book contained ideas that would eventually reshape Western philosophy, influence Freud's theory of the unconscious, inspire Wagner's greatest operas, and provide the philosophical foundation for an entire tradition of pessimistic thought that extends into our present moment. Almost nobody read it. For the next 3 decades, Schopenhauer lived in relative obscurity, while lesser minds dominated European intellectual life. He watched mediocre philosophers build careers on ideas he considered sophistical nonsense. He saw his rivals awarded university chairs, published in prestigious journals, celebrated in salons. His own masterwork gathered dust in publishers' warehouses. Then at age 63, he finally achieved the recognition he had craved his entire adult life. Students sought him out. Disciples formed around his work. European intellectuals began speaking his name with reverence. He spent his final years as the celebrated sage he had always believed himself to be. This is the story everyone knows about Arthur Schopenhauer, the lonely genius, the philosopher ahead of his time, the misanthrope who despised humanity and was proven right when humanity finally caught up to him. Every part of that story is true, and every part of that story is a lie. Because what the standard narrative never addresses is the central contradiction that defined Schopenhauer's entire existence. The philosopher who built a systematic argument for withdrawing from human desire spent decades desperately desiring human recognition. The man who preached that all striving is futile devoted his life to furious striving for fame. The thinker who claimed to have transcended the will's torments was tormented daily by the will's most basic drive, the hunger to be seen, understood, valued. The real question is not why Schopenhauer was ignored for 3 decades. The real question is what it means that a philosopher whose entire system was built on the virtues of desirelessness could not live a single day without desire. The real question is whether his philosophy was wisdom or wound. Before we go further into Schopenhauer's world, I want to ask something of you. If you're finding value in this exploration, if you're curious where this story leads, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely matters to me and helps ensure I can keep creating these deep dives into fascinating lives. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below and let me know. Are you in Frankfurt, where Schopenhauer spent his final decades? In India, where he found the texts that shaped his philosophy? Or somewhere else entirely? I'd love to hear from you. Arthur Schopenhauer was born on February 22, 1788 in the free city of Danzig, a wealthy Hanseatic trading port where German merchants had built fortunes on the movement of goods between Western Europe and the Baltic regions. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, belonged to the patrician merchant class, families whose wealth and social standing came not from noble birth but from commercial success maintained across generations. These were people who valued independence, honor, and the practical virtues of trade above the aristocratic pretensions of inherited titles. The Schopenhauer residence stood on a street lined with the tall, narrow houses characteristic of Hanseatic prosperity. Inside, the rooms were furnished with the understated elegance of merchant wealth, solid oak furniture, paintings depicting trading vessels and distant ports, ledgers stacked on Heinrich's desk like monuments to commercial diligence. The air smelled of pipe tobacco and the faint brine that drifted in from the harbour, mixing with the scent of beeswax polish on wood floors that creaked under young Arthur's footsteps. Even as a child, Arthur was acutely sensitive to the emotional atmosphere of the household. He would later recall the weight of silence that often settled over the dinner table, his father's stern face illuminated by candlelight, his mother's polite but distant smile. The house felt like a place where duty was performed rather than where life was celebrated. There was wealth, certainly. There was comfort. But there was also something missing, some warmth that other families seemed to possess, and that the Schopenhauer household lacked. Heinrich was a stern man, prone to depression, obsessed with maintaining the family's commercial reputation. He had built his life according to rigid principles of honor and self-reliance. When Arthur was 5 years old, Prussia annexed Danzig, effectively ending the city's status as a free republic. Heinrich, who valued independence above all else, refused to live under Prussian rule. He liquidated his business interests and moved the entire family to Hamburg, sacrificing established commercial networks rather than compromise his principles. The move was traumatic for young Arthur. He had known only Danzig, its cobbled streets and harbour sounds, the specific quality of light that reflected off the Motlava River. Hamburg was larger, busier, more cosmopolitan, but it was also foreign. The boy had to learn new streets, make new acquaintances, adapt to a household that was itself adapting to displacement. He watched his father become more rigid, more withdrawn, as if Heinrich's principles had cost him something he could not quite acknowledge losing. This was Arthur's first lesson in the cost of conviction. His father had chosen ideological purity over practical benefit, uprooting the family's entire life rather than accept a change in political circumstances. It was the kind of absolutist thinking Arthur would later apply to philosophy, the same unwillingness to compromise that would make him schedule his university lectures directly opposite Hegel's, ensuring his own academic failure rather than accommodate the philosophical establishment. Arthur's mother Johanna was a different creature entirely. Where Heinrich was severe and principled, Johanna was sociable and pragmatic. Where Heinrich brooded over honor, Johanna cultivated relationships. She had married into the merchant class at age 19, more for security than passion, and she had done her duty by producing 2 children. But she was not fulfilled by domesticity. She was intellectually curious, artistically inclined, and increasingly frustrated by the limitations of her role as merchant's wife. Young Arthur would watch his mother at her writing desk, her pen moving across pages with a fluidity that contrasted sharply with his father's laboured entries in commercial ledgers. She read novels in French, corresponded with friends about literature and art, seemed to live partly in a world beyond the household's walls. Arthur craved her attention with an intensity that frightened him even as a child. When she looked at him with genuine interest, when she asked about his thoughts or praised his intelligence, he felt a warmth that seemed to make the entire world bearable. But those moments were rare. More often, Johanna's gaze would pass over him with benign distraction, her mind already elsewhere, attending to correspondence or planning for social engagements. The family dynamic was clear to young Arthur. His father demanded obedience and groomed him for commercial success. His mother provided warmth, but was fundamentally more interested in the broader world of ideas and culture than in intensive mothering. Neither parent offered unconditional emotional availability. Both had agendas for what Arthur should become. At age 9, Arthur was sent to live with a family friend in Le Havre, France, for 2 years. The ostensible purpose was language acquisition and cultural exposure, the kind of education wealthy merchant families provided their sons. But there was also an element of removal. Arthur was already a difficult child, intellectually precocious but emotionally demanding, prone to dark moods that seemed to echo his father's depression. The separation served multiple functions. It made Arthur fluent in French, which would later allow him to engage directly with French philosophical texts. It exposed him to Catholic culture distinct from his German Protestant upbringing, and it taught him that belonging was conditional, that family was something you could be sent away from if you failed to fit properly. The years in Le Havre existed in Arthur's memory as a period of strange suspension. He lived with the Gregoire family, who were kind, but whose kindness felt like duty rather than affection. He attended school with French boys who tolerated the German visitor but never fully accepted him into their circle. He learned to speak French with near-native fluency, but he also learned that language mastery does not guarantee belonging. At night, in the unfamiliar room of the Gregoire house, he would sometimes allow himself to cry silently, careful not to make sounds that might disturb the household, weeping for reasons he could not fully articulate even to himself. When Arthur returned to Hamburg at age 11, the tension with his father intensified. Heinrich had a plan for his son's future. Arthur would apprentice in the family business, learn the intricacies of international trade, eventually take over the commercial operations that had provided the family's wealth and standing. It was a reasonable plan by merchant-class standards. The business was profitable. Arthur would inherit substantial wealth. He would live comfortably as a respected member of Hamburg's commercial elite. Arthur hated everything about this plan. He had no interest in trade. He found the concerns of merchants petty and spiritually empty. He wanted to study, to think, to engage with ideas rather than commodities. But he was 15 years old, financially dependent, and completely subject to his father's authority. Heinrich was unmovable. The family business was Arthur's destiny. The arguments between father and son grew more frequent and more bitter. Heinrich would present his case with the rigid logic of commercial necessity. The business represented generations of accumulated capital and reputation. Arthur had a duty to the family name. Intellectual pursuits were luxuries that could be indulged only after securing practical foundations. Arthur would respond with the desperate eloquence of adolescent conviction. Life was more than commerce. The soul required nourishment beyond profit margins. He would rather die than spend his existence calculating tariffs and shipping costs. In 1803, Heinrich offered a compromise that was really a trap. The family would undertake an extended tour of Europe, visiting major cities, exposing Arthur to the broader world of culture and commerce. If Arthur completed this tour and still wanted to pursue academic studies rather than business, Heinrich would consider it. But if Arthur accepted the tour, he would be committing to at least attempting the merchant path. Arthur accepted. He was 15, desperate for any concession, and the prospect of extensive travel was genuinely exciting. What he could not see was that his father was using the tour as a test. Heinrich believed that once Arthur saw the reality of European commerce, the opportunities available to a wealthy merchant's son, the practical benefits of the life being offered, he would abandon his impractical intellectual fantasies. The tour lasted nearly 2 years. The family traveled through the Netherlands, Britain, France, Switzerland, Austria, and Prussia. They visited factories, trading houses, and commercial centers. They met with Heinrich's business associates. They observed the mechanisms of European trade. What Arthur observed was human suffering. In London, the fog rolled thick off the Thames, carrying the acrid smell of coal smoke and industrial waste. Heinrich took Arthur to visit a textile factory in the East End, one of the modern marvels of British manufacturing. Inside the factory, the noise was deafening. Looms clattered in mechanical rhythm, creating a soundscape that felt like violence against the ears. And among the machines, Arthur saw children. They were younger than he was. Some appeared to be no more than 7 or 8 years old. They moved between the looms with exhausted precision, their small hands performing tasks that required them to reach into spaces where adult hands would not fit. Their faces were pale, their bodies thin, their eyes holding an expression Arthur would never forget, not quite alive, not quite dead, just enduring. One girl caught his attention. She could not have been more than 9. As Arthur watched, her hand slipped and the loom caught her finger. She did not scream. She simply pulled back, wrapped the bleeding finger in a dirty rag, and returned to work. The overseer had not even noticed. This was routine. This was normal. This was the mechanism by which cloth was produced and profit was generated. Heinrich explained the economics as they left the factory. Labor costs, productivity metrics, the competitive advantages of British manufacturing. He spoke with the calm detachment of someone describing natural phenomena. Arthur heard his father's words but could not reconcile them with what he had just witnessed. Those children were not economic units. They were human beings being destroyed systematically, their bodies and spirits consumed as raw materials in the production of wealth. In Paris, Arthur saw poverty that rendered human beings nearly bestial in their desperation. Beggars lined the streets near the fashionable districts where Heinrich conducted his business. Arthur watched an old woman search through refuse, competing with dogs for scraps of food that might still be edible. He saw a man with no legs pulling himself along the cobblestones on a wooden board, his arms muscled from years of this locomotion, his voice hoarse from calling out for charity that rarely came. Across industrial Europe, he witnessed the machinery of production consuming human life as raw material. The wealth he had grown up taking for granted was built on systematic exploitation. The comfortable world of the merchant class existed because somewhere else people were being destroyed. This was not the lesson Heinrich intended to teach. Heinrich wanted Arthur to see the dynamism of commerce, the opportunities available to men of ambition and capital. Instead, Arthur saw that the entire system was predicated on suffering. Some people extracted wealth, other people were consumed. In the extraction, there was no metaphysical justice to it. It was simply how human society organized itself. Years later, Schopenhauer would write that the world is a kind of hell, where some serve as devils tormenting others. The central image of his philosophy, the idea that existence itself is structured as suffering, did not come from abstract meditation. It came from being 15 years old and watching his father show him the future while children died in factories. In 1805, when Arthur was 17, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer fell from a warehouse granary into the canal below and drowned. The official record called it an accident. The family knew it was almost certainly suicide. Heinrich had been declining for months, his depression worsening, his anxiety about business matters intensifying. He had become paranoid, convinced that financial ruin was imminent despite all evidence that the family's wealth was secure. He had grown increasingly isolated, even from Johanna. On April 20th, 1805, he went to inspect goods at a warehouse facility he owned. At some point during that inspection, he fell from an upper floor into the water below. No one witnessed the fall. His body was recovered from the canal. There was no suicide note. But Heinrich had been expressing despair for weeks. He had been dwelling on mortality and failure. And the circumstances of the fall, the specific location, the time of day, all suggested this was not a simple industrial accident. Arthur received the news in the parlor of their Hamburg home. A business associate of Heinrich's came to the door, hat in hand, face grave, with the specific expression people wear when delivering news they wish they did not have to deliver. Johanna was called. The associate explained what had happened, or what was known about what had happened, which was very little. Heinrich was dead. The circumstances were unclear. The body would need to be identified. Arthur felt nothing at first. Then he felt everything at once, grief and guilt and relief and horror, all mixed together in a way that made it impossible to know what he was actually feeling. His father was dead. The man who had demanded Arthur become someone he was not, who had tried to shape Arthur's entire future according to rigid principles of commercial duty, who had been both obstacle and authority, was simply gone. And Arthur was free, but the freedom came through death and carried the permanent stain of unresolved conflict. Arthur never spoke directly about whether he believed his father committed suicide, but the timing was devastating. Arthur was 17 at the exact moment when the tension between his father's demands and his own desires had reached its crisis point. He had completed the tour. He had fulfilled his side of the compromise. And now Heinrich was dead before they could resolve what came next. Arthur felt guilt. He had resented his father's demands. He had wanted escape from the merchant destiny being imposed on him, and now his father was gone and Arthur was free, but the freedom came through death and carried the permanent stain of unresolved conflict. He would spend his entire life trying to determine whether he had wanted his father's release or his own, whether the desire for independence had somehow caused the thing that granted it. What Heinrich left Arthur was wealth, a substantial inheritance, carefully structured, that would generate income for the rest of Arthur's life. The merchant business would be liquidated, the assets converted to securities and properties that would yield steady returns without requiring active management. Arthur would never need to work. He would never need to compromise his intellectual pursuits for financial survival. He could study philosophy for decades without selling a single book and remain perfectly comfortable. This was the most important fact of Schopenhauer's intellectual life. He was not an academic grinding out publications to secure tenure. He was not a writer desperate to sell books to pay rent. He was a wealthy man engaging in philosophy as a kind of extended luxury that his inherited capital made possible. This freedom shaped everything he wrote. He never had to make his ideas palatable to colleagues or popular with readers. He could pursue truth without compromise because he had no material need for approval. But that freedom came from his father's death, possibly his father's suicide, possibly his father's final accusation that Arthur's rejection of the merchant path had driven him to despair. The wealth that made Schopenhauer's philosophy possible was blood-soaked with guilt and unresolved conflict. In 1807, Arthur abandoned his merchant apprenticeship entirely and enrolled in gymnasium to prepare for university study. His mother, Johanna, now a wealthy widow living in Weimar and establishing herself in literary society, supported this decision. She had never particularly wanted Arthur to become a merchant. She preferred having a son who might bring intellectual distinction to the family name. But Johanna's support was not what Arthur craved. What he craved was her admiration, her recognition that he was special, her devotion to his intellectual development. What he got was polite encouragement paired with a clear preference for her own social life. Johanna was building a salon in Weimar, hosting writers and artists, publishing her own novels. She was becoming somebody. Arthur was a brilliant but difficult son who required management more than mothering. The letters Arthur wrote to his mother during this period revealed the depth of his need and the sharpness of his disappointment. He would describe his studies, his philosophical insights, his reading of Plato and Kant, always with an undertone of desperate hope that she would recognize his brilliance, that she would validate his choice to pursue scholarship rather than commerce. Johanna's replies were affectionate but brief, offering maternal encouragement, but always returning quickly to her own news, the latest salon gathering, the progress on her novel, the distinguished visitors she was hosting. She was proud of Arthur in the abstract, but she was not devoted to him in the way he needed her to be. In 1809, Arthur enrolled at the University of Göttingen, initially studying medicine before switching to philosophy. In 1811, he transferred to the University of Berlin specifically to study with Johann Gottlieb Fichte, one of the major figures in German idealism, the philosophical movement that dominated German universities. Arthur attended Fichte's lectures for months. He took careful notes. He tried to extract value from the elaborate system Fichte was constructing, and gradually he concluded that Fichte was a pompous fraud whose entire philosophical system was verbose nonsense designed to obscure the absence of genuine insight. The lecture halls in Berlin were grand spaces designed to convey the importance of the intellectual work conducted within them. High ceilings, tall windows, rows of wooden benches ascending in tiers so that every student could see the professor at his lectern. Fichte would enter these halls with theatrical gravitas, his presence commanding attention before he spoke a single word. His lectures were performances, elaborate constructions of dialectical reasoning that built complex systems of concepts, each term defined by its relationship to other terms in an ever-expanding web of abstraction. Arthur sat in those lectures growing increasingly frustrated. The more he listened, the more convinced he became that Fichte was using complexity to hide confusion, that the elaborate terminology was compensating for the absence of real content. Fichte spoke of the ego positing itself, of thesis and antithesis resolving into synthesis, of the absolute manifesting through dialectical development. But when Arthur tried to pin down what any of this actually meant, what real insights were being communicated beneath the technical vocabulary, he found nothing but circularity and obfuscation. This judgment was not purely intellectual. There was something temperamental in Arthur's response to Fichte. Fichte was celebrated, well-connected, academically successful. He held a prestigious chair at Berlin. He was exactly the kind of philosopher the German university system rewarded. And Arthur found him worthless. This pattern would repeat throughout Arthur's life. He would encounter celebrated thinkers, study their work carefully, and conclude they were charlatans. The more celebrated they were, the more certain Arthur became of their worthlessness. It was not simply that he disagreed with their ideas, it was that their success proved the corruption of the institutions granting them success. In 1813, at age 25, Arthur completed his doctoral dissertation at the University of Jena. The work was titled On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, and it attempted to systematize Kant's epistemology by identifying 4 distinct forms of explanation that govern different domains of experience: physical causation, logical inference, mathematical necessity, and moral motivation. Each operated according to different rules, but all were species of a single fundamental principle, that nothing exists without a reason, why it exists rather than not. The dissertation was genuinely accomplished work. It demonstrated Arthur's command of Kantian philosophy and his ability to extend Kant's insights in novel directions. The examiners at Jena accepted it without reservation. Arthur was now Dr. Schopenhauer, a credentialed philosopher with published work. What the dissertation also revealed was Arthur's core intellectual method. He was not interested in building complex dialectical systems like Fichte or Hegel. He was interested in finding the single fundamental principle that explained everything else. He wanted the root insight that, once grasped, would make all other philosophical problems dissolve. This was not the method of academic philosophy, which valued systematic elaboration and dialectical complexity. This was the method of someone searching for a single key that would unlock all doors. In 1814, Arthur had been living in Weimar near his mother while working on what would become his major philosophical work. Johanna's salon was flourishing. She had published successful novels. She was hosting Goethe himself, the greatest literary figure in German culture. Her home was a center of intellectual and artistic life. Arthur's room in his mother's house was on the second floor, overlooking the garden. It was a comfortable space, well lit, furnished with a desk where he worked on his manuscript. But comfort did not translate to contentment. He could hear the salon gatherings from his room, the sound of conversation and laughter rising up through the floorboards. Sometimes he would descend to join these gatherings, hoping to engage with the assembled intellectuals, to demonstrate his own philosophical insights, to be recognized as more than Johanna's difficult son. These attempts rarely went well. Arthur had not yet learned to moderate his contempt for ideas he considered inferior. When someone would offer an opinion Arthur found philosophically naive, he would not let it pass politely. He would correct them, often with a condescension that made the correction feel like an attack. The other salon guests would grow uncomfortable. Johanna would intervene with forced levity, trying to smooth over the tension, and Arthur would retreat back to his room, burning with the injustice of being surrounded by people who valued politeness over truth. Arthur was furious. He saw his mother prioritizing social climbing over genuine intellectual depth. He saw her treating her literary acquaintances as more important than her own son. He saw her living a life of superficial sociability while he was engaged in the work of actually understanding existence. The specific trigger for the final break is not entirely clear from the surviving records. There was an argument. Arthur said things about his mother's friends, her literary pretensions, her failures as a mother. Johanna responded by telling Arthur that his philosophical manuscript would be in warehouses when the complete stock is sold as waste paper. She called him unbearable. She said she could not live with someone so determined to see the worst in everything and everyone. The words hung in the air between them, terrible in their finality. Johanna had struck at the core of Arthur's being, his belief that his philosophical work represented something of enduring value, that he was engaged in truth-seeking that transcended the petty social maneuvering of Weimar's literary circles. To have his mother, of all people, dismiss his life's work as future waste paper was a betrayal Arthur could not forgive. Arthur left his mother's house and never saw her again. They lived until 1838, which means they did not speak for 24 years. Johanna died without reconciling with her son. Arthur never forgave her for valuing her salon over him, for mocking his life's work, for fundamentally failing to see his genius. What Arthur never acknowledged was that Johanna's prediction was accurate. His philosophical manuscript, published in 1818, would in fact sit in warehouses. The stock would not sell. It would be decades before anyone read it. Johanna was not being cruel in some arbitrary way. She was being honest about what the market would likely do with a pessimistic metaphysical treatise by an unknown author. But Arthur heard her honesty as rejection, her realism as maternal betrayal. This is the wound that explains almost everything else. Arthur's father had demanded he become someone he was not, then died before they could resolve it. Arthur's mother had failed to provide the unconditional recognition he needed, then predicted his philosophical failure. Both parents had, in their different ways, told Arthur he was not acceptable as he was. Both had imposed conditions on their love, conditions Arthur could not or would not meet. His philosophy would become an extended argument that desire is suffering, that the will is a blind force of torment, that the only rational response to existence is withdrawal from striving. But the emotional foundation of that philosophy was his own unmet desire for recognition, his own suffering at not being seen and valued, his own inability to withdraw from the hunger for approval he spent his life claiming to transcend. In 1818, at age 30, Arthur Schopenhauer published The World as Will and Representation, and this was the work he had been building toward since his dissertation, the systematic philosophy that would explain the fundamental nature of reality and the human condition. He believed it was the most important philosophical work since Kant's Critiques. He expected it would immediately establish him as a major thinker. The book's central argument went like this. Kant had shown that we never perceive things as they are in themselves, only as they appear to us through the forms of space, time, and causality that structure human experience. But Kant had also claimed we could never know what things are in themselves, that the noumenal realm was forever closed to us. Schopenhauer argued Kant was wrong on this final point. We do have access to the thing in itself, but not through perception. We access it through internal experience, through the immediate awareness of our own willing. When you experience desire, when you feel hunger or fear or sexual attraction, you are not perceiving your body from outside. You are being your body, experiencing reality from inside the thing in itself. And what you discover there is will, not rational will, not free will, not will in any sense that implies conscious control, just blind, striving, insatiable will. The force that drives your hunger, that animates your fear, that makes your heart beat without your decision, that manifests as every impulse and desire you experience. This will, Schopenhauer argued, is not unique to you. It is the fundamental nature of all reality. The thing in itself, the noumenal ground that appears in space and time as the phenomenal world, is will. Everything that exists is will objectifying itself. Animals are will. Plants are will. Even inorganic matter, in its chemical affinities and physical forces, is will. The entire universe is blind striving, purposeless driving, endless wanting without possibility of final satisfaction. This is why existence is suffering, because will cannot be satisfied. Every desire fulfilled creates a new desire. Every goal achieved reveals another goal beyond it. The happiness that comes from satisfying desire is merely temporary cessation of suffering, a brief pause before new suffering begins. And between the suffering of unfulfilled desire and the boredom of fulfilled desire, human life oscillates without escape. Schopenhauer was not saying life contains suffering as one of its features. He was saying life is suffering, that suffering is the essential nature of existence, that any appearance of happiness is illusory relief from the fundamental condition. This was not depression, this was metaphysics. He believed he had demonstrated that the structure of reality itself guarantees suffering. The book offered 3 possible responses to this condition. The first was aesthetic contemplation. When experiencing genuine art or natural beauty, you temporarily forget yourself and your desires. You become pure perceiving subject without will. The suffering ceases because the will is momentarily suspended. But this relief is temporary. The moment passes and you return to willing. The second response was compassion. When you recognize that other people are also manifestations of will, that their suffering is the same as your suffering, you overcome the illusion of separation between self and other. You see through the phenomenal distinction between individuals to the noumenal unity of will. This recognition produces compassion, the only genuine moral emotion, but again, it does not end suffering. It only spreads the recognition of suffering more widely. The third response was asceticism, the deliberate denial of the will, the refusal to want, the mortification of desire through discipline and renunciation. This was the path of saints and mystics, the attempt to starve the will into quiescence. Schopenhauer believed this was the only genuine escape from suffering, but he acknowledged it was nearly impossible to achieve. The will does not want to be denied. It fights back with every tool available. This was the philosophy Schopenhauer believed would revolutionize Western thought. It was systematic, rigorous, built on Kantian foundations while extending far beyond Kant. It incorporated insights from Plato and the Upanishads and Buddhist texts that were just beginning to be translated into European languages. It was pessimistic, but not nihilistic, offering genuine responses to the suffering it diagnosed. And it was written with unusual clarity for German philosophy, in prose that communicated rather than obscured. The book sold approximately 100 copies in its first several years. Most of those went to university libraries that acquired it automatically as part of their standing orders with the publisher. Essentially, no one read it. There were virtually no reviews. The few that appeared were dismissive or confused. The German philosophical establishment, dominated by Hegelian idealism, had no interest in a pessimistic metaphysics grounded in Eastern thought. Arthur checked with his publisher obsessively during those first months after publication. Each time he visited, he hoped to hear that orders were increasing, that reviews were being prepared, that the philosophical community was beginning to take notice. Each time he left with the same devastating news. Nothing had changed. The books sat in the warehouse. The intellectual world remained indifferent. He would walk the streets of Dresden, where he was living at the time, and imagine scenarios where his work would suddenly be discovered. Perhaps a prominent philosopher would stumble across it and recognize its significance. Perhaps a journal editor would assign it to an open-minded reviewer. Perhaps word of mouth among students would create demand that the establishment could not ignore. These fantasies sustained him for weeks, then months. But as the first year passed, then the second, then the third, the fantasies became harder to maintain. What made the silence particularly painful was that Arthur knew the work was good. This was not the defensive posturing of a mediocre thinker protecting his ego. Arthur had read Kant thoroughly, had engaged deeply with Plato, had absorbed the Upanishads with genuine comprehension. His synthesis was original, rigorous, and clearly written. The book deserved serious engagement even from readers who would ultimately reject its conclusions. The fact that it received nothing, not even substantial criticism, suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the system that determined which philosophy received attention. Arthur was devastated. He had spent years on this work. He had poured his entire intellectual life into it. He had expected recognition, celebration, an immediate response that would establish him as a major voice. Instead, he received almost perfect silence. He blamed the Hegelians. He blamed the university system. He blamed the corruption of German intellectual culture. What he could not accept was that his book was simply not what anyone wanted to read in 1818. Europe was recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. The Congress of Vienna had established a conservative order focused on stability. Hegel's philosophy, with its optimistic faith in reason and progress, suited the moment. Schopenhauer's pessimism did not. In 1820, Arthur made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He accepted a position as lecturer at the University of Berlin. This was not a professorship. It was a much lower rank, essentially an instructor, who could offer courses but had no guaranteed salary. Payment came from student fees, so income depended on enrollment. Arthur knew exactly what he was doing. Berlin was Hegel's university. Hegel held the prestigious chair of philosophy and drew huge crowds to his lectures. He was the dominant intellectual figure in German philosophy, celebrated by the establishment, published widely, training the next generation of philosophers. Arthur scheduled his lectures at the exact same time as Hegel's. This was not accidental. This was not a scheduling mistake. Arthur deliberately chose to offer his course on the history of philosophy in direct competition with Hegel's course on the same subject. He believed that students, given a choice between Hegel's sophistical nonsense and his own clear truth would choose truth. The first lecture arrived. Arthur stood in his assigned classroom, notes prepared, ready to demonstrate his philosophical superiority to any students bold enough to choose his course over Hegel's. He waited. The scheduled start time passed. A few students trickled in looking uncertain, glancing at each other as if confirming they were in the right place. 5 students total. Arthur began his lecture to this tiny audience, his voice echoing in the half-empty room, while down the hall, Hegel addressed hundreds in a space filled to capacity. 5 students enrolled in Arthur's course. Within weeks, that number dropped to 0. Arthur was lecturing to an empty room, while down the hall, Hegel addressed hundreds. The contrast was not subtle. The university's judgment of relative value was absolutely clear. Arthur withdrew from teaching after a single semester. He would never hold an academic position again, and he would spend the rest of his life insisting that his failure to attract students proved the corruption of the university system rather than any limitation in his own approach. What the Berlin episode reveals is Arthur's complete inability to compromise. He could have offered his course at a different time. He could have built an audience gradually. He could have played the academic politics necessary to establish himself within the system. Instead, he created a test where the only possible outcomes were total triumph or total failure, then interpreted his failure as vindication of his contempt for the system. This pattern would repeat constantly. Arthur would set up situations where he could succeed only through immediate total recognition, then use the absence of immediate recognition as proof that the world was blind and corrupt. He was not wrong that the university system was flawed. He was not wrong that Hegel's dominance had more to do with institutional politics than philosophical merit. But he was incapable of distinguishing between the system's corruption and his own contribution to his marginalization. Between 1820 and 1831, Arthur lived primarily in Berlin, traveling occasionally, but maintaining the capital as his base. These were difficult years. His philosophical work was ignored. His teaching career had collapsed before it started. The intellectual culture around him celebrated everything he despised. Hegel was at the peak of his influence, defining the terms of philosophical debate for an entire generation. Arthur did not respond by accommodating himself to the situation. He responded with escalating contempt. He wrote scathing marginalia in his copies of Hegel's books, calling him stupid, clumsy, a charlatan. He described Hegelian philosophy as a colossal piece of mystification that would eventually be exposed as the fraud it was. He convinced himself that history would vindicate him and expose his enemies. During this period, Arthur also began a relationship with a young woman named Caroline Medden, a chorus girl and dancer. The relationship lasted approximately 10 years, making it the longest romantic involvement of Arthur's life. What little we know about Caroline suggests she was intelligent, independent, and had no interest in becoming the kind of devoted helpmeet Arthur seemed to want. She maintained her own residence. She maintained her own career. She saw Arthur when she chose to see him. Caroline represented something Arthur could never quite grasp. A person who genuinely liked him without being overwhelmed by him, who enjoyed his company without subordinating her own life to his needs. She would visit his apartment, and they would talk for hours about theatre and music and the absurdities of Berlin society. She found his misanthropy amusing rather than off-putting. She seemed to understand that beneath his philosophical pessimism was a man who desperately wanted connection but did not know how to achieve it without demanding total devotion. Their evenings together followed a pattern that Arthur found both comforting and frustrating. Caroline would arrive after her performances, still energized from the stage, bringing with her stories of the theatre world that Arthur found simultaneously fascinating and trivial. He loved hearing her describe the backstage dramas, the petty rivalries among performers, the absurd demands of directors. These stories confirmed his views about human nature while also providing a window into a world where people actually connected with each other, however superficially. But when the conversation turned to their relationship, the comfort evaporated. Arthur would probe about her feelings, her commitment, her vision of their future together. Caroline would deflect with humor or change the subject. She enjoyed what they had. She was not interested in what Arthur wanted it to become. This left Arthur in a state of perpetual uncertainty. He had enough of Caroline to make her absence painful, but not enough to feel secure. The relationship exemplified the very suffering his philosophy described, desire that could never be fully satisfied, oscillating between the pain of unfulfillment and the boredom of routine. Arthur's letters from this period make clear that he wanted more from the relationship than Caroline was willing to provide. He wanted commitment, domesticity, perhaps marriage. Caroline wanted companionship and financial support, but not subsumption into Arthur's life. The relationship became a source of ongoing frustration for Arthur, another arena where his desires were not met, another space where other people failed to give him what he needed. When the relationship finally ended around 1830, the break seems to have been Caroline's decision. She may have found someone else, or simply grown tired of Arthur's demands. The surviving records do not clarify what happened. What we know is that Arthur was hurt by the ending, but also, perhaps, relieved. The relationship had become evidence for his philosophy, proof that connection brings suffering, that intimacy requires compromise he was unwilling to make, that other people inevitably disappoint. Better to withdraw into solitude than subject himself to this cycle of hope and disappointment. In 1825, something happened that reveals the gap between Arthur's philosophy and his practice. A seamstress named Caroline Marquet lived in the building where Arthur had his apartment. She had a habit of gossiping with other tenants in the hallway outside his door. Arthur found this intolerable. It disturbed his work. It represented the kind of trivial sociability he despised. One day, Arthur emerged from his apartment and demanded that Marquet and her companions leave. They refused or did not move quickly enough. Arthur became enraged. He physically grabbed Marquet and pushed her away from his door. She fell down a flight of stairs. Marquet sued Arthur for assault. The case proceeded through Berlin courts for years. Eventually, Arthur was found liable and ordered to pay Marquet a quarterly pension for the rest of her life. This was not a trivial punishment. The pension obligation lasted for decades until Marquet's death in 1840. When Marquet finally died, Arthur wrote in his journal, "Obit anus, abit onus." The old woman dies, the burden is lifted. This is the man who preached compassion as the foundation of ethics. This is the philosopher who argued that recognizing the suffering of others was the only genuine moral response. He could not extend that recognition to an elderly seamstress he had injured through his own violence. The Marquet case reveals something Arthur never wanted to examine. His philosophy called for the denial of will, the transcendence of egoistic desire, the recognition of universal suffering. But he could not tolerate minor inconvenience to his routine. A seamstress talking in a hallway triggered rage so intense that he committed physical violence. The gap between his theory and his practice was not occasional hypocrisy. It was systematic self-deception. In 1831, cholera swept through Berlin. Hegel died of the disease in November. Thousands of others died as well. Arthur, who had always been hypochondriacal and terrified of illness, fled the city. He travelled south, eventually settling in Frankfurt am Main. He intended to stay temporarily until the epidemic passed. He would remain in Frankfurt for the rest of his life. 29 years in the same city, in increasingly settled routine, never moving more than a few streets from his residence. This is one of the mysteries of Schopenhauer's biography. He had money, he was healthy, he had no professional obligations tying him to any location. He could have lived anywhere in Europe. He had travelled extensively in his youth and enjoyed it. Yet, after 1831, he never left Frankfurt for more than brief trips. Part of the explanation is simply age. Arthur was 43 when he settled in Frankfurt, no longer young, increasingly set in his habits. Part of the explanation is the trauma of the cholera epidemic, which seems to have reinforced his anxieties about disease and death. But part of the explanation may be that Arthur had given up on the kind of life that required movement. He was not building an academic career that might lead to positions in different cities. He was not pursuing relationships that might pull him elsewhere. He had settled into a life structure where external events mattered less than internal routine. Frankfurt offered what Arthur needed. It was a comfortable city, neither too large nor too small. It had good restaurants and theatres. It had access to books and journals. Most importantly, it had no associations with his past failures. He could establish himself anew, create a daily routine that served his work, live quietly while waiting for the recognition he still believed would eventually come. Arthur developed a pattern that he maintained with only minor variations for the rest of his life. He woke early and worked on philosophy for several hours without interruption. He ate lunch at the same restaurant, at the same table, at the same time every day. He took a long walk in the afternoon, usually accompanied by one of the poodles he kept in succession, all named either Atman or Butz. He attended the theatre several evenings per week. He read extensively, especially English journals and periodicals. He went to bed at a regular hour. The walks were sacred to Arthur. Every afternoon, regardless of weather, he would leave his apartment with his poodle and walk a circuit through Frankfurt's streets and parks. He observed the city with the attention of someone who had nothing else demanding his focus. He noted the changing seasons in the trees lining the main river. He watched merchants opening and closing their shops according to rhythms that had persisted for generations. He saw the same faces day after day, the baker on his corner, the newspaper vendor near the cathedral, the old woman who fed pigeons in the park. There was a particular route Arthur preferred, a loop that took him along the river, through the botanical gardens and back through the commercial district to his apartment. The walk took exactly 2 hours when he maintained his preferred pace. He knew every turn, every landmark, every place where the light fell in particular ways at particular times of day. This familiarity was not boring to Arthur. It was comforting. The walk was the one part of his day where he had complete control, where nothing unexpected could intrude, where the world conformed to his understanding of it. The poodles who accompanied these walks became, in Arthur's later years, his most consistent companions. He treated them with an affection he rarely showed to human beings. The dogs demanded nothing beyond food, shelter, and the daily walk. They offered companionship without judgment, presence without expectation. They were, in a sense, the perfect relationship for someone whose philosophy claimed that all human connection inevitably leads to suffering. Arthur could project onto his poodles whatever qualities he needed them to have. They could not disappoint him through having desires of their own that conflicted with his. Frankfurt's residents grew accustomed to seeing the elderly philosopher walking with his dog each afternoon. Some recognized him from his growing fame in the 1850s. Others simply knew him as the gentleman who maintained such a precise routine. There were rumors about his eccentricities, that he spoke to his dog in Sanskrit, that he kept loaded pistols in his apartment out of paranoia about revolution, that he had never recovered from a failed love affair in his youth. Some of these rumors were true, others were embellishments. Arthur did nothing to correct them. In fact, he may have enjoyed the aura of mystery and eccentricity. It confirmed his outsider status, his separation from ordinary society. These walks were not exercise, they were meditation in motion, a way of processing the philosophical work of the morning, of allowing ideas to settle and connections to form. Arthur would walk for 2 hours, sometimes more, his poodle trotting beside him, his mind working through problems that had no immediate solutions. Passers-by who recognized him would nod politely. Arthur would nod back, maintaining the minimal courtesies required for urban coexistence while preserving the solitude he needed. This routine was not merely habitual, it was protective. Arthur had learned that the world would not accommodate his needs. Other people would not provide the recognition he craved. Institutions would not reward his genius. So he built a structure that minimized his exposure to the world's judgments. Within his routine, he could be productive, comfortable, master of his environment. Outside his routine was chaos, disappointment, the constant reminder that he was not valued as he deserved. The routine also enabled continued work. Between 1831 and 1851, Arthur published multiple books and essays while living his quiet Frankfurt life. In 1836, he published On the Will in Nature, attempting to show how scientific discoveries in biology and physics supported his metaphysics. In 1839, his essay On the Freedom of the Human Will won a prize from the Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences. In 1840, his essay on the foundation of morality was submitted to the Royal Danish Society, which rejected it for being insufficiently respectful toward other philosophers. The Danish rejection particularly stung Arthur. The essay had argued that compassion was the only genuine basis for morality, that all ethics reduced to the recognition of others' suffering. It was careful philosophical work making a serious argument. But Arthur had also taken multiple opportunities in the essay to mock Hegelian moral philosophy as verbose nonsense. The Danish judges found this tone inappropriate for academic discourse. Arthur published the essay himself along with the Norwegian prize essay under the title The Two Fundamental Problems of Ethics. In his preface, he attacked the Danish judges, academic philosophy generally, and Hegelian domination of German universities. He framed the rejection as further evidence that honest philosophy was being suppressed by institutional corruption. What Arthur could not see was that his own aggression was making his marginalization worse. He was not simply being ignored because his philosophy was too radical or pessimistic. He was being ignored because he had made himself impossible to engage with. Every publication attacked someone. Every argument included insults. Every interaction with the philosophical establishment became an opportunity to demonstrate his contempt. He had created a situation where even philosophers who might have found value in his work had no professional incentive to engage with him. In 1844, Arthur published a second edition of The World as Will and Representation. The first edition from 1818 had long been out of print, not because it had sold out, but because the publisher had no interest in reprinting a book that had not sold. Arthur paid for the second edition himself, adding a substantial second volume of essays and elaborations that was actually longer than the first volume. The second edition fared slightly better than the first, but only slightly. A few reviews appeared in academic journals, a handful of philosophers took notice, but there was still no breakthrough, no sudden recognition, no rush to embrace his ideas. Arthur was 56 years old. His major work had been available for more than 2 decades, and he was still largely unknown. What Arthur was doing during these decades of obscurity was continuing to work. This is the central fact that the standard narrative tends to obscure. Arthur was not languishing in despair. He was not paralyzed by rejection. He was living a comfortable routine, producing philosophical work, refining his ideas, engaging with new scientific discoveries, reading voraciously, corresponding with the few people who did engage with his philosophy. The obscurity was real. The lack of recognition was genuine. But Arthur was not suffering from poverty or illness or inability to work. He was suffering from not being famous, which is a very specific kind of suffering, available only to people whose material needs are completely met. This matters for understanding what Arthur's philosophy actually was. He wrote about suffering, but he wrote from a position of extraordinary material privilege. He wrote about the need to deny the will, but he lived on income from investments that required no labor on his part. He wrote about the futility of striving, but he spent decades striving for recognition. His philosophy claimed to transcend the conditions of ordinary existence, but it was made possible by precisely those conditions. In the 1840s, Arthur began receiving letters from admirers, not many, but some. Young men who had encountered his work and found in it something they had been looking for. These admirers started visiting Frankfurt to meet the philosopher whose work had affected them. Arthur welcomed these visits. He was gracious with genuine admirers, generous with his time, willing to explain his ideas at length. What Arthur craved was not solitude, it was recognition. When he received recognition, he was capable of warmth, engagement, even generosity. The misanthropic hermit persona was what he projected when the world failed to see his value. When the world did see his value, even in small ways, he responded with genuine human connection. This suggests that Arthur's pessimism was not purely philosophical, it was also strategic. As long as he could frame the world as too corrupt to recognize truth, he did not have to examine whether his own approach contributed to his marginalization. The pessimism protected him from the possibility that his failures were partly his responsibility. In 1851, Arthur published Parerga and Paralipomena, a 2-volume collection of essays and aphorisms covering topics from aesthetics to ethics to the philosophy of religion. The work was more accessible than his systematic treatises, written in a style designed for general readers rather than academic philosophers. The publisher who accepted the manuscript did so reluctantly and offered minimal terms. Arthur accepted those terms because he was desperate for any publication. He was 63 years old. He had been largely ignored for his entire career. This might be his last chance to reach a broader audience. The publication changed Arthur's life. Parerga and Paralipomena was reviewed in major journals. The reviews were often critical, but they were substantive engagements rather than dismissals. Readers bought the book. Intellectuals began discussing Schopenhauer's ideas in salons and universities. Students at German universities started reading his work. By 1853, Arthur was receiving regular visitors in Frankfurt. Disciples were forming around his philosophy. He was being invited to contribute to journals. His earlier works were being reprinted. At age 65, Arthur Schopenhauer was finally becoming the famous philosopher he had always believed he should be. The change in Arthur's circumstances was dramatic. Where once he had been ignored, now his opinions were solicited. Where once publishers had rejected his work, now they competed for the rights to reprint his earlier writings. Where once he had lectured to empty rooms, now young men traveled to Frankfurt specifically to sit at his feet and learn from him. The reversal was everything Arthur had dreamed of during those long decades of obscurity. Yet the triumph was complicated by its timing. Arthur was 65 years old when fame arrived. His habits were completely settled. His worldview was fully formed. His capacity for surprise or transformation had largely atrophied. The recognition he received could not reshape him because there was no longer a self flexible enough to be reshaped. He could enjoy being famous, certainly. He could take satisfaction in vindication, but he could not become a different person because of fame. The recognition had arrived too late for that. Moreover, Arthur could not help but notice that many of his new admirers had not actually engaged deeply with his systematic philosophy. They loved the aphorisms in Parerga and Paralipomena, the quotable pessimism, the permission to complain about life's difficulties. But had they worked through his epistemology? Had they wrestled with his metaphysics of will? Had they understood the subtlety of his engagement with Kant? Arthur suspected that for many of his readers, his philosophy was fashionable pessimism rather than serious metaphysics. They were attracted to the mood, not the system. This suspicion created a strange new form of isolation. Arthur was surrounded by admirers, but he was not sure they truly understood him. He was famous, but perhaps famous for the wrong reasons. He had spent decades being ignored by people who dismissed his work without reading it. Now he was being celebrated by people who read his work, but grasped only its surface. In both cases, the actual content of his philosophy, the careful arguments he had spent his life constructing, remained largely unengaged. The question is why this happened in 1851 and not in 1818. The ideas were the same, the arguments were the same, Arthur's contempt for Hegelian philosophy was the same. What had changed was not the content of his philosophy, but the cultural context in which it was received. By 1851, Hegel had been dead for 20 years. The Hegelian system that had dominated German philosophy was beginning to seem dated. A new generation of thinkers was looking for alternatives to idealism's optimistic rationalism. The revolutions of 1848 had failed, producing widespread disillusionment with political progress. The industrial transformation of Europe was creating new forms of alienation and suffering. Schopenhauer's pessimism suddenly seemed less like morbid eccentricity and more like honest recognition of reality. Arthur had not changed to meet the moment. The moment had changed to meet Arthur. He had outlasted his enemies. Hegel was dead. The Hegelian system was collapsing under its own complexity, and Schopenhauer's clear pessimism looked like intellectual courage rather than personal bitterness. But there was also an element of pure contingency. Parerga and Paralipomena was more accessible than Arthur's earlier works. It appeared at a moment when a prominent journal happened to review it favorably. That review led to other reviews, which led to sales, which led to more attention. None of this was inevitable. If the first review had been dismissive, if the book had appeared 2 years earlier or later, the entire trajectory might have been different. Arthur experienced his late fame as vindication. He had been right all along. The world had been wrong to ignore him. Now the world was recognizing its error and giving him the recognition he deserved. He spent his final years receiving visitors, corresponding with disciples, enjoying the celebrity he had craved his entire life. What he never examined was whether the vindication was as complete as he believed. He was famous, yes, but famous for what? He was famous for being a pessimist, for the quotable aphorisms in Parerga and Paralipomena, for being an interesting counter-voice to mainstream philosophy. But was his systematic metaphysics actually being engaged seriously? Were philosophers working through his arguments about will and representation? Or was he popular because pessimism was fashionable and he had written entertainingly about suffering? There is evidence that Arthur's late fame was more celebrity than serious philosophical engagement. His visitors often came expecting a sage who embodied his philosophy, living in ascetic withdrawal from worldly desire. What they found was a well-dressed man who enjoyed good food and fine wine, who attended the theatre regularly, who lived very comfortably on inherited wealth. The gap between the philosophy and the man was jarring for many visitors. One young admirer, arriving in Frankfurt in 1857, left a detailed account of his meeting with Schopenhauer. He had travelled from Berlin specifically to meet the philosopher whose work had transformed his understanding of existence. He expected to find someone living in Spartan monastic simplicity, perhaps in a bare room with only books and basic necessities. Instead, he was received in a comfortable bourgeois apartment filled with art and comfortable furniture. Schopenhauer served excellent wine. They discussed theatre performances Schopenhauer had recently attended. The philosopher complained about his housekeeper's cooking while acknowledging she was generally competent. The young man left confused. This was not the life of someone who had renounced worldly pleasures. This was the life of a comfortable gentleman of independent means who happened to have written books about suffering. When he tentatively raised this observation, Schopenhauer responded with some irritation. He had never claimed to be a saint, he said. He had written about what sainthood would require, which is a different matter entirely. The philosophy was description, not autobiography. To confuse the two was to misunderstand what philosophy is. But the young admirer's confusion was not unreasonable. Schopenhauer's philosophy was not presented as detached description. It was presented as truth that demanded response. The tone was urgent, personal, ethical. It read like testimony from someone who had seen clearly and was reporting back. The disconnect between that tone and the comfortable life Schopenhauer actually lived created legitimate questions about whether the philosophy was genuine insight or elaborate rationalization. But Arthur did not see himself as hypocritical. He saw himself as human. His philosophy described the human condition, the inescapability of willing, the difficulty of genuine ascetic denial. He had never claimed to be a sage who had transcended will. He had claimed to understand will's nature and to have identified the theoretical possibility of transcendence. There is a difference between understanding what liberation would require and achieving that liberation. The problem is that Arthur's philosophy does not leave room for that distinction. If will is the fundamental nature of all existence, if desire is inescapable suffering, if recognition of universal suffering should produce compassion, then a philosopher who lives comfortably while preaching about suffering is not merely failing to embody his philosophy. He is demonstrating that his philosophy is actually a rationalization of personal comfort, a way of making privilege and isolation seem like wisdom. Consider what Arthur's life actually looked like in his final Frankfurt years. He woke each day in a comfortable apartment filled with books and art. He had a housekeeper who managed his domestic needs. He ate well-prepared meals at a good restaurant. He walked through parks with his dog. He attended theatre performances. He received admiring visitors. He read journals and corresponded with intellectuals across Europe. In the evenings, he sat in his study, surrounded by his accumulated work, finally receiving the recognition he had desired for decades. The apartment itself was a reflection of Arthur's contradictions. The main room served as both study and sitting room, lined with bookshelves that held works in German, French, Latin, and English. A portrait of Kant hung on one wall, the only authority Arthur acknowledged without reservation. Near the window stood a small statue of the Buddha, acquired during his years of studying Eastern philosophy. The furniture was well made but not ostentatious. A solid desk where he worked each morning, comfortable chairs for receiving visitors, a settee where he would recline in the evenings with a book. The bookshelves revealed the scope of Arthur's intellectual interests. Kant's complete works occupied a place of honor, volumes worn from repeated reading. The Upanishads and other Eastern texts sat nearby, testifying to Arthur's conviction that Indian philosophy had grasped truths that Western rationalism had missed. There were works of literature, Shakespeare, Goethe, Calderon, authors Arthur considered genuine artists rather than mere entertainers. Scientific journals and periodicals were stacked on tables, evidence of Arthur's ongoing engagement with empirical discoveries he believed supported his metaphysics. But there were also unexpected elements: fashion magazines, which Arthur read to stay current with social trends he claimed to despise, financial newspapers, which he studied carefully to monitor his investments, theatre programs from performances he had attended, annotated with his opinions of the actors and productions. The apartment contained both the scholar pursuing timeless wisdom and the bourgeois gentleman managing his comfortable existence. The two were not reconciled, they simply coexisted, like Arthur himself. Visitors would sometimes comment on the pistols Arthur kept loaded in his desk drawer. He explained them as practical precaution. Frankfurt had experienced revolutionary unrest in 1848, and Arthur feared such violence might return. He wanted to be prepared to defend his property, but there was something excessive in his precautions, something that suggested deeper anxieties. Arthur had spent his life fearing that the world would intrude on his carefully constructed solitude. The pistols were a material expression of that fear, tools to keep chaos at bay, to maintain the boundary between his controlled interior space and the unpredictable world beyond his door. This is not the life of someone who has transcended desire. This is the life of someone whose desires have been met. The desire for material comfort was met by inheritance. The desire for intellectual engagement was met by books and correspondence. The desire for recognition was met by his late fame. Arthur had not escaped the will's torment. He had satisfied the will's demands sufficiently to experience what he claimed was impossible, sustained contentment derived from fulfilled desire. What this reveals is that Arthur's pessimism was not philosophical discovery. It was the philosophy of a man whose specific desires were not met when he wanted them met. He wrote his major work at 30, expecting immediate fame. When that fame did not come, he interpreted the delay as proof that desire fulfillment is impossible. But when fame finally arrived at 63, it made him happy. It gave him the exact satisfaction he had claimed was illusory. The standard defense of Arthur would be that his late happiness proves nothing about his philosophy. Individual cases do not refute metaphysical claims. The fact that one person achieves temporary satisfaction does not disprove the argument that suffering is existence's fundamental nature. Arthur could acknowledge his own happiness while maintaining that his philosophy correctly described reality as a whole. But this defense does not work because Arthur's philosophy is grounded in individual experience. His entire epistemology is based on the claim that we access the thing in itself through internal awareness of our own willing. If Arthur's internal experience in his final years was contentment rather than suffering, then his metaphysics loses its foundation. He cannot claim that will is essentially suffering if his own willing leads to satisfaction. What Arthur never addressed is the class dimension of his philosophy. Pessimism is the luxury of someone whose material needs are guaranteed. If you are wealthy enough to never worry about survival, then desire can seem like an arbitrary torment. If you have to work to eat, then desire is the mechanism of survival. Arthur's philosophy takes the perspective of inherited wealth and universalizes it. He assumes that everyone's relationship to desire is like his relationship to desire, that we want things we do not need for survival. That satisfaction brings boredom rather than relief, that the entire structure is pointless suffering. But this is only true for people who have already solved the problem of material survival. For people who are actually struggling, desire is not metaphysical torment, it is practical necessity. Hunger is not the will's blind striving, it is the body's need for food. Arthur's philosophy erases this distinction because he never experienced that form of need. His inheritance meant he could treat desire as philosophical problem rather than survival mechanism. This does not make Arthur's philosophy worthless, but it does reframe what kind of philosophy it is. It is not universal metaphysics. It is the specific philosophy of a specific class position at a specific historical moment. It is what philosophy looks like when produced by someone who has material security but lacks social recognition, who has objective comfort but subjective disappointment. In the late 1850s, Arthur's health began to decline. He was in his 70s, which was old age by 19th century standards. He developed the heart and respiratory problems common to elderly men. He struggled with stairs. His daily walk became shorter, but his mind remained clear. He continued to work on revisions and additions to his published works. He corresponded with disciples and admirers. He maintained his daily routine as much as his health allowed. The physical decline was frustrating for Arthur. His mind remained as sharp as ever, but his body was betraying him. The walks that had been sacred rituals became difficult exercises. The stairs to his apartment, which he had climbed daily for nearly 3 decades, now required rest stops halfway up. His hands, which had written thousands of pages of dense philosophical prose, sometimes trembled when he tried to hold a pen for extended periods. Yet Arthur adapted. If he could not walk for 2 hours, he would walk for 1. If his hands trembled, he would write in shorter sessions throughout the day. The routine persisted in modified form because the routine was essential. It was what held chaos at bay, what gave structure to existence, what made aging bearable. Other men facing death might have sought comfort in religion or family. Arthur had only his routine and his conviction that his work would endure after his body failed. His disciples noticed the changes. Letters from this period express concern about Arthur's health and encouragement to rest rather than continuing to work so intensively. Arthur dismissed these concerns. What else should he do with his remaining time? Sit idle and wait for death? That would be submission to the will's meaningless striving. Better to continue working, to refine his arguments, to clarify his insights for future readers who might understand them better than his contemporaries had. There is something admirable in this determination, but also something tragic. Arthur could not rest because rest would require confronting what his philosophy claimed, that all his striving had been ultimately pointless, that his work would be misunderstood or forgotten, that his suffering had no redemptive meaning. The work protected him from his own philosophy. As long as he kept writing, kept corresponding, kept receiving visitors, he could maintain the illusion that his life meant something beyond the blind willing he had spent decades describing as existence's fundamental nature. On the morning of September 21st, 1860, Arthur Schopenhauer sat down to breakfast at his usual table. At some point during the meal, he suffered heart failure. His housekeeper found him dead, sitting upright, apparently having passed without struggle or apparent pain. He was 72 years old. There is no record of final words. There was no deathbed scene with gathered disciples. Arthur died alone in the way he had lived his final decades, in routine, without drama, at his usual place doing his usual thing. If you accept his philosophy, this is the best possible death. No prolonged suffering, no desperate clinging to life, just cessation. Arthur left a carefully structured will. The bulk of his estate went to fund a trust for soldiers disabled in the Prussian army's response to revolutionary uprisings. This choice has puzzled biographers because Arthur generally despised political causes and had sided against the revolutionaries in 1848. The most likely explanation is that he wanted to specify recipients who would not be connected to the philosophical establishment that had ignored him. Disabled soldiers had no relationship to academic philosophy and thus could not corrupt his legacy through interpretation. He also left money for his poodle Atman, though the poodle predeceased him, and he left money to maintain the grave of Caroline Marquet, the seamstress he had pushed down the stairs decades earlier. This final gesture toward Marquet is difficult to interpret. Was it genuine remorse? Was it an attempt to manage his reputation by appearing to care about someone he had injured? The journal entry celebrating her death suggests the gesture was not motivated by compassion. In the immediate aftermath of Arthur's death, obituaries appeared across European journals and newspapers. He was recognized as a major philosophical figure whose pessimism had challenged the optimistic rationalism of earlier decades. His influence on artists and writers was acknowledged. Wagner, who had been profoundly influenced by Schopenhauer's aesthetics, publicly mourned him. Young philosophers who had found in Schopenhauer an alternative to academic idealism treated his death as the loss of an intellectual father. But the obituaries also noted the gap between Arthur's philosophy and his life. Multiple writers commented on the irony of a pessimist living comfortably on inherited wealth. Some suggested that Arthur's misanthropy was less philosophical position than personality defect. The obituaries were respectful but not reverential. They treated Arthur as an important but flawed thinker whose work would need to be separated from his personal limitations. Over the next several decades, Arthur's influence expanded in ways he could not have anticipated. Friedrich Nietzsche, born 12 years before Arthur's death, discovered Schopenhauer's work in the 1860s and was profoundly affected. Nietzsche's early philosophy was essentially an attempt to respond to Schopenhauer's pessimism by affirming existence rather than denying it. Even after Nietzsche moved beyond Schopenhauer, the encounter with pessimism remained foundational to his thought. Richard Wagner incorporated Schopenhauerian themes into his mature operas, especially Tristan und Isolde, which dramatized the philosophy of desire as suffering and renunciation as the only escape. The opera's emotional power came partly from Wagner's ability to translate philosophical abstraction into sensory experience. Audiences felt pessimism through Wagner's music in ways they could not feel it through Arthur's prose. Leo Tolstoy discovered Schopenhauer in the 1860s and experienced the philosophy as revelation. Tolstoy's late religious conversion, his embrace of asceticism and renunciation, his rejection of worldly success, all bore Schopenhauer's influence. The difference was that Tolstoy actually attempted to live the philosophy. He tried to give away his wealth. He tried to live simply. He tried to deny the will in practice, not just theory. This made Tolstoy's life much more difficult than Arthur's, but also more consistent with the philosophy he espoused. Thomas Hardy's pessimistic novels, portraying characters trapped by blind forces beyond their control, working themselves to exhaustion without possibility of fulfillment, reflected Schopenhauerian worldview in literary form. Hardy saw Will operating in the unconscious drives that destroy his characters despite their conscious intentions. This was Schopenhauer's philosophy given narrative form. In the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis partly through engagement with Schopenhauerian ideas. Freud's concept of the unconscious, of drives operating below conscious awareness, of the fundamental conflict between desire and civilization, all had roots in Schopenhauer's metaphysics. Freud claimed he had not read Schopenhauer before developing his own theories, and this may be technically true. But Schopenhauerian ideas were so pervasive in European intellectual culture by the late 19th century that Freud absorbed them indirectly, even if he never read the source texts. What happened to Arthur's philosophy over the century after his death was transformation through appropriation. Nietzsche took the pessimism and inverted it. Wagner took the metaphysics and musicalized it. Tolstoy took the ethics and tried to live them. Freud took the psychological insights and medicalized them. Each of these appropriations changed what Schopenhauer had meant, extracting elements while leaving other elements behind. The systematic metaphysics, the careful arguments about representation and will, the Kantian epistemology, all of this technical philosophy was largely abandoned. What survived was the pessimism, the sense that existence is fundamentally suffering, the recognition that desire creates torment, the identification of compassion as the only genuine moral response. These ideas became part of European cultural consciousness in a way that transcended academic philosophy. This raises the question of what Arthur actually contributed. Did he discover metaphysical truth about the nature of reality? Or did he articulate a mood, a way of experiencing existence that resonated with certain people at certain historical moments? The academic philosophy largely did not survive. The mood survived and shaped culture for generations. If we accept that what survived was mood rather than metaphysics, then Arthur's significance is different than he believed. He thought he was Kant's true successor, completing the critical philosophy by revealing the thing in itself. He thought he was doing science, using empirical observations about desire and suffering to construct a systematic worldview. What he actually did was give philosophical legitimacy to pessimism, showing that one could build a rigorous system around the sense that existence is fundamentally disappointing. This is not nothing. The permission to be pessimistic, to reject optimism's demands, to say honestly that life is difficult and suffering is real, this has value. For people experiencing depression, loss, trauma, or simply the ordinary difficulties of being human, Arthur's philosophy offers validation. It says, you are not crazy for finding existence hard. You are not failing for not being happy. The difficulty is in the nature of things, not in your individual inadequacy. But the problem with pessimism as philosophy is that it provides no resources for response beyond withdrawal. Arthur's philosophy can help you understand why you suffer. It cannot help you with what to do about suffering beyond denying the will, which Arthur himself admitted was nearly impossible. This is why his philosophy was appropriated and transformed by others. Wagner, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Freud, all of them took elements of Schopenhauer and combined those elements with other traditions that offered more resources for living. What Arthur's philosophy could not address was the question of whether the suffering he described was necessary or contingent. He treated suffering as metaphysical constant, built into reality's fundamental structure. But much of the suffering he described was actually social, produced by specific forms of economic organization, family structure, gender relations, class hierarchy. Arthur experienced his mother's rejection as proof that desire is torment, but that rejection was produced by a patriarchal family system that gave Johanna few options for independence beyond rejecting the son who demanded she subordinate her own desires to his needs. Arthur experienced his academic failure as proof that recognition is impossible to achieve, but that failure was produced by a university system that required conformity to institutional norms Arthur refused to perform. The suffering was real, but it was not metaphysical inevitability. It was the result of specific social arrangements that could have been different. This is the fundamental limitation of Arthur's philosophy. By making suffering essential rather than contingent, by grounding pessimism in metaphysics rather than sociology, he removed the possibility of addressing suffering through social change. If suffering is built into will's nature, then revolution is pointless. If desire is necessarily torment, then creating better conditions for desire's fulfillment makes no difference. All you can do is withdraw. This is why Arthur's philosophy was politically conservative, despite his personal disdain for most political institutions. It offered no basis for imagining or working toward better arrangements. It could criticize existing conditions as forms of suffering, but it could not distinguish between necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering, between the pain that comes from existence itself and the pain that comes from how human beings organize their shared existence. In the decades since Arthur's death, the world has changed in ways that expose his philosophy's limitations. Material conditions have improved for billions of people. Medical advances have reduced physical suffering. Social movements have expanded rights and opportunities. None of this has eliminated suffering, but it has changed suffering's forms and distributions. The fact that suffering persists does not validate Arthur's metaphysics. It suggests that suffering is complex, that some forms can be addressed while others remain, that the relationship between desire and satisfaction is more variable than Arthur's system allowed. What has endured from Arthur's philosophy is not the metaphysical system, but the psychological insight that desire is difficult, that satisfaction is often temporary, that the gap between what we want and what we get is a source of ongoing pain. This insight does not require metaphysics. It simply requires honesty about subjective experience. Arthur was honest about his own experience in ways most philosophers were not. He acknowledged the hunger for recognition, the sting of rejection, the difficulty of living with desires that cannot be satisfied. But he made the mistake of universalizing his own experience. He assumed that because desire was torment for him, desire must be torment for everyone. He assumed that because recognition came too late for him, recognition must always be inadequate. He built a metaphysical system that claimed to describe reality, but actually described his own subjective relationship to reality. This is not unique to Arthur. Most systematic philosophers make this error. They take their own perspective and present it as universal truth. What makes Arthur's case particularly clear is the gap between his philosophy's claims and his life's reality. He preached withdrawal while desperately seeking engagement. He preached desirelessness while consumed by desire for fame. He preached compassion while physically assaulting people who annoyed him. The contradictions are too stark to ignore. The question is what we do with those contradictions. One response is to dismiss Arthur as hypocrite, to say his philosophy is invalidated by his failure to live it. Another response is to see the contradictions as evidence that his philosophy was never meant to be lived, that it was always a theoretical exercise rather than practical guide. But there is a third response. We can see the contradictions as the actual content of Arthur's contribution. What he demonstrated was not that pessimism is true metaphysics. What he demonstrated was that intelligent, self-aware people still struggle with desire, still fail to live their ideals, still experience the gap between theory and practice. His life was not proof of his philosophy. His life was proof that philosophy is not enough. Arthur spent decades writing about the need to deny the will, to transcend desire, to withdraw from worldly striving. He never managed to do any of those things himself. He kept desiring recognition. He kept striving for fame. He kept engaging with the world he claimed to have transcended. This does not make him dishonest. It makes him human. What Arthur's life reveals is that knowing intellectually what would liberate you does not give you the capacity to achieve that liberation. Understanding that desire causes suffering does not eliminate desire. Recognizing that recognition is insufficient does not stop you from craving recognition. The philosophy can be true at the level of analysis while remaining impossible at the level of practice. This gap between knowledge and capacity is one of the deepest problems in philosophy. Socrates claimed that no one does wrong knowingly, that if you truly understood what was good, you would naturally do it. Arthur's life refutes this Socratic optimism. He understood what his philosophy recommended. He knew he should deny will, renounce desire, practice compassion. He could not do it. Knowledge was insufficient. This insufficiency suggests that philosophy itself has limits. It can analyze, diagnose, clarify. It can show you what liberation would require. But it cannot give you the psychological, emotional, or spiritual resources to achieve that liberation. For that you need something other than philosophy, religion, community, therapy, practice, discipline, some form of intervention that works at the level of habit and character rather than intellectual understanding. Arthur had none of those resources. He had only his philosophy and his routine. The routine worked as harm reduction, allowing him to live comfortably despite not transcending will. But it was not liberation. It was management. He managed his desires enough to avoid acute suffering while never achieving the release his philosophy described. In his final years, receiving visitors and disciples, Arthur presented himself as sage who had achieved the understanding his philosophy promised. He had the white hair, the routine, the accumulated wisdom, the quotable aphorisms. He looked the part. But the visitors who knew his work well could see the gap. This was not a man who had transcended will. This was a man who had been defeated by will, who had made peace with that defeat, who had built a philosophy that allowed him to feel wise in his defeat. There is a profound sadness in this realization. Arthur spent his entire adult life working toward liberation from suffering through understanding suffering's nature. He believed that seeing clearly would itself be liberating. What he discovered was that seeing clearly just made him see his own imprisonment more accurately. He could describe the bars but not escape them. This is the emotional reality beneath Arthur's pessimism. It was not abstract metaphysics, it was lived experience of being trapped, of being unable to become what he knew he should become, of being stuck in patterns he could analyze but not break. The philosophy was both diagnosis and symptom. He correctly identified that desire causes suffering. But his inability to transcend that desire despite knowing it caused suffering was itself the deepest suffering. The final irony is that Arthur did achieve much of what he desired. He became famous, his work was read, disciples sought him out. He influenced major cultural figures. By conventional standards, his life was successful, but success came too late in the wrong form. After he had already built a philosophy around the impossibility of success, he could not fully enjoy his late fame because his philosophy told him that enjoyment was illusory, that satisfaction was temporary, that the recognition he had craved was ultimately empty. This suggests that Arthur's pessimism became self-fulfilling. His philosophy predicted that desire fulfillment would not satisfy. When desire was fulfilled, he interpreted his response through his philosophy, finding evidence for pessimism even in positive outcomes. The philosophy became a lens that filtered all experience to confirm its own truth. This is not wisdom. This is the rationalization of depression. But Arthur's depression, if that is what we should call it, was not simply personal pathology. It was response to genuine losses and genuine social failures. His father's likely suicide was real trauma. His mother's rejection was real abandonment. His academic marginalization was real professional failure. The suffering his philosophy described was not purely invented. It was his attempt to make sense of real pain. The question is whether his response to that pain was wisdom or defense. Did his philosophy help him understand and respond to suffering? Or did it protect him from having to change anything about how he lived? By claiming that suffering was metaphysically necessary, he absolved himself of responsibility for addressing the contingent sources of his own suffering. By claiming that desire fulfillment was impossible, he never had to examine why his specific desires remained unfulfilled for so long. Arthur's philosophy let him be passive. It let him wait for recognition rather than do the work of making himself recognizable to his contemporaries. It let him blame Hegel and the university system rather than examine his own contribution to his marginalization. It let him maintain contempt for humanity rather than do the difficult work of connection. The pessimism was intellectually sophisticated, but functionally it served to justify his isolation. This realization does not invalidate everything Arthur wrote. His analysis of desire, his critique of optimistic rationalism, his introduction of Eastern philosophy to Western discourse, all of this has value, but it reframes what kind of value it has. Arthur was not a sage who had transcended suffering and was reporting back on liberation. He was a wounded man who built a philosophy around his wounds, who tried to make his isolation seem like wisdom, who spent his life trying to convince himself and others that he had chosen his suffering rather than being shaped by it. The most honest moment in Arthur's life may have been the 1814 break with his mother. That scene contained no philosophy, no systematic argument, no metaphysical claims. It was just a son and mother who could not love each other in the ways they needed, who failed each other fundamentally, who chose permanent separation rather than continue failing each other. Everything Arthur wrote after that was an attempt to make sense of that failure, to find universal meaning in personal pain. Johanna told Arthur his book would become waste paper. She was wrong factually. The book endured, but she was right psychologically. The book was Arthur's attempt to convert personal waste, the discarded emotional material of childhood trauma and unmet need, into philosophical gold. The conversion was partial at best. The philosophy bore the marks of its origin. You can see the waste paper underneath the systematic argument if you look closely. This is not unique to Arthur. All philosophy bears the marks of the philosopher's life, the specific problems they were trying to solve, the specific pain they were trying to address. What makes Arthur's case instructive is how clearly the connection shows. Most philosophers hide their personal stakes more effectively. Arthur's pessimism is so obviously the philosophy of someone whose specific needs were not met that it becomes a kind of case study in how personal experience becomes systematic thought. The lesson is not that we should dismiss Arthur's philosophy because it came from personal pain. The lesson is that we should read all philosophy with attention to what personal stakes it serves, what problems it solves for the philosopher rather than for philosophy as such. Ideas do not come from pure reason operating on abstract problems. Ideas come from human beings trying to make sense of their lives, trying to justify their choices, trying to find meaning in their suffering. Arthur wanted to believe that his suffering had metaphysical significance, that his isolation was cosmic rather than personal, that his inability to connect was humanity's inability rather than his own. The philosophy gave him this belief. It let him frame his failures as forms of success, his isolation as transcendence, his wounds as wisdom. This is what philosophy can do when it serves psychological need rather than truth. But perhaps we are being too harsh. Perhaps Arthur's contribution was precisely this demonstration that philosophy is always personal, that systematic thought always serves psychological functions, that the attempt to separate philosophical truth from philosophical motivation is itself a mistake. By failing so obviously to live his philosophy, by displaying his contradictions so clearly, Arthur showed future philosophers the impossibility of the sage ideal. There is no position outside suffering from which to describe suffering. There is no transcendence of desire from which to analyze desire. There is only the ongoing attempt to understand experience while being shaped by experience, to analyze pain while being in pain, to think clearly while being fully human. Arthur tried to think from a position outside humanity. His failure to achieve that position, displayed across decades of documented life, is perhaps his deepest teaching. We see in Arthur's letters and journals a man who wanted desperately to be good by his own philosophy's standards. He wanted to deny will, to feel compassion, to withdraw from striving. He wrote detailed descriptions of what this would require. He admired the saints and mystics who had achieved it. And day after day, he failed to achieve it himself. He got angry at seamstresses, he craved fame, he enjoyed good food and theatre, he lived comfortably while preaching renunciation. This failure is human, but it is also specifically the failure of philosophy that claims to be more than philosophy, that claims to offer practical guidance for living rather than merely theoretical understanding. If Arthur had presented his work as description of suffering rather than prescription for responding to suffering, the gap between theory and practice would matter less. But he offered his philosophy as solution, as the path to liberation, and he could not walk that path himself. What remained for Arthur in his final years was the recognition that he had wanted, but that came too late to reshape his life. He was famous, but he was also old and alone. His disciples admired him, but they were not friends in any full sense. His routine was comfortable, but it was also the routine of someone who had given up on fundamental change. He had achieved the success his philosophy claimed was impossible, which should have refuted his philosophy. Instead, it confirmed his philosophy by arriving too late and in forms that could not satisfy. This is the deepest sadness of Arthur's life. He was right that desire causes suffering. He experienced that truth directly. But he was wrong that understanding this truth would liberate him from it. The understanding just made him suffer more consciously, with full awareness of what he was suffering and why. This is not liberation. This is a specific form of torment available only to the self-aware. Arthur died at breakfast in his routine, having achieved his desires too late for them to transform his life. If his philosophy was correct, this is the best possible outcome. Desire fulfilled too late to cause more suffering. Recognition arriving after the capacity to be reshaped by recognition has passed. Death without prolonged illness or degradation. Just cessation at the usual table doing the usual thing. But if we reject Arthur's pessimism, if we believe that desire fulfillment can genuinely satisfy, that recognition can genuinely transform, that connection is possible and valuable, then Arthur's life becomes tragedy. He spent decades in unnecessary isolation. He rejected possible relationships out of principle. He structured his life to minimize vulnerability to disappointment, and in doing so, minimize the possibility of joy. He got what he wanted too late because he had spent his life making himself someone who could not receive what he wanted. The question the audience must now answer differently than they would have at the start is this: was Arthur Schopenhauer a philosopher who transcended desire, or a man who failed to satisfy desire and called his failure transcendence? The answer determines whether his pessimism was wisdom or wound, whether his life demonstrated his philosophy's truth or its inadequacy, whether we should read him as guide or warning. There is evidence for both answers. The ambiguity is the point. Arthur's life does not resolve into single meaning. It remains suspended between interpretation and counter-interpretation, like his philosophy, which claimed to reveal final truth but left everything questionable. What we can say with certainty is this: Arthur Schopenhauer was a human being who suffered, who tried to understand his suffering, who built a systematic philosophy around that understanding, who failed to live that philosophy, and who died having achieved recognition too late for it to heal what needed healing. He was brilliant and wounded. He was honest and self-deceiving. He saw clearly and saw wrongly. He helped many people understand their suffering while failing to relieve his own. He was not the sage his late admirers wanted him to be. He was not the bitter misanthrope his early detractors claimed he was. He was something more interesting and more human than either version, a person trying very hard to make sense of existence while being fully subject to existence's difficulties. His philosophy was not final truth. It was one man's sustained attempt to find meaning in conditions that resisted meaning. In the end, what Arthur deserved was not the recognition he craved. What he deserved was to be seen as he was, a human being doing his best with inadequate resources to solve impossible problems. He deserved compassion, the very quality his philosophy named as highest virtue. He deserved to be understood in his contradictions rather than celebrated or dismissed based on partial readings. He deserved to be forgiven for failing to live his ideals while being honored for the seriousness with which he pursued those ideals. He deserved better than the story we told about him. The story that made him either sage or charlatan, either wisdom teacher or depressive misanthrope. He was neither and both. He was a philosopher who spent his life trying to escape suffering through understanding it, who discovered that understanding is not enough, who showed future generations what philosophy can and cannot do. That is not the story everyone knows, but it is closer to the truth of what Arthur Schopenhauer's life meant, what his philosophy revealed, and what his failure to transcend his own suffering teaches us about the limits of systematic thought in the face of human complexity. He built a philosophy that claimed life is suffering. His life demonstrated that philosophy itself suffers, that even the most rigorous thought cannot escape the conditions it tries to analyze. And perhaps that failure, honestly examined, is more valuable than the transcendence Arthur promised but never achieved, because we are all failing to transcend our conditions. We are all thinking while being shaped by what we think about. We are all trying to understand suffering while suffering. Arthur just did it with unusual clarity and unusual desperation, leaving a record that shows both the power and powerlessness of philosophical thought in the face of human need.